Okay, welcome back. This is the build video for the Tamiya EZ8 Sherman. I'll be building, well, I was going to say I was building this one straight out of the box, but I'm obviously not. So we've got photo etch to chuck into this one, along with some aftermarket decals. And I've also got the photo etch light guards there from Eduard, who helpfully don't include them in their etch fret, so you get to buy them extra. A little bit like the seatbelts in some of their aircraft sets. And some aftermarket decals there, which, spoiler alert, but I don't use any of them. I do, but it doesn't end up being those. But more of that in the next video. So there we go, typical stuff. Lovely box of Tamiya plastics. Let's have a look at it. So starting off, it's one of those things where I keep getting amazed at just how good the fit is, and if anyone's built a Tamiya kit, you'll know exactly what I mean. It's just there's nothing like it, really. Really, something like this I would look at in kind of a little bit of dread, really. Building up the hull, the lower hull, out of side bits all separate, but being Tamiya, as I say, you just clip it together and glue it on exactly how it asks, and when you come to align it all, it just works. So it's really great stuff. Another thing I've noticed as well with the Tamiya plastic and their cement seems to work well as good as it. The cement with the plastic works as good as any plastic I've used. So it seems as though they've almost formulated their plastic and glue together. So that might not make sense, but to me it seems like it works particularly good with Tamiya plastic. So here we go, just putting the cross section or the support there for the whole sides in the middle. And again, I mean, you would look at that and think, well, that's not going to work, but it's Tamiya and it just works. It's perfectly engineered to come together without any problems. It's just easy, and then you just dab the glue there, run it along the seam, melts it instantly, especially if you use the quick setting, and away you go. So for building up the sides, it's absolutely no problem, and it's a joy to work with. And I've filmed quite a lot of this, just showing you, this part pops into that part, and it just fits. And on to the next bit, it pops in again. So it's a perfect candidate to add a bit of extras too. So with the photo etch and that just gives you a bit more refinement. So if you're new to arm modelling, or you're new to modelling or anything like that, Tamiya kits is certainly a good way to go. And if you're old school and you've been modelling for years, and maybe you're even like me and you build short run kits and that sort of thing, Tamiya kits are still a challenge in many ways. So they can be a real mojo booster, which this has been, although it has ended up being a bit of a long-winded build. So here we go. This is the part for the rear section of the lower hull, which is here now on the back plate for the hull. And that, using the polycap in there, is part of the way that the upper hull joins to the lower hull. So again, typical fashion for Tamiya kits, that it's all very cleverly thought out, and with another piece of plastic that you put, that you'll see a bit later on, it kind of slots in. There we've got a rear access door there going on, so again just slots right in, and we've got the exhausts coming up in a minute as well, which I'm just sort of showing you how they sit, because I leave them separate because they're obviously a different colour, and you can see very nice detail there. Looks very good. So impressive all through. And again, we've got another piece. I'm not actually sure what this is. Something to do with the rear sort of rear deck, rear engine access panel, something like that. It quite usefully blocks off the connector there that you can see sticking out, which obviously was not part of the real tank. There you go. Again, aligns perfectly, exactly how you want it to be. It's spot on. Takes all the guesswork out, which is great stuff. And here again, just showing you It's going to be repeating myself just how good the fit is. This is modern Tamiya, but my experience is they've been like this since the mid-90s and before. So, any kit really in their catalogue fits like this, from what I can tell. You just find some of the detail may not be quite as refined. You might not have some of the cast texture or casting numbers and that sort of thing, but ultimately, if fit is what you're concerned with, Tamiya kits are great for that. So here you can see some of the cast texture there actually on that front part, and you can see it just around where the sprockets go on those arms that are sticking out there. I'm just adding some of these refined hooks here at the front, and that's weld beads that they actually sit into there, that rectangle that's just slotted into, which you could improve. Especially if you watch a lot of Uncle Night Shift's videos, you could do it a lot better. For me, this was fine, but I take on board, you could sand all of that off and redo it if you wanted to go to town. This was kind of a return to detailing armour for me, which I used to do a lot when I was younger, and it was a good step into it, really. My approach to armour is I like to detail it to as much as I'm happy with. So sometimes there's things that are inaccurate which I'm happy to let go, to be honest, but other times I do like to add a little bit of refinement. So here you could have built this out of photo etch or plasticard and redone it, but for me it's round the back of the tank. You've got to look up at it, so you're barely going to see it anyway. That's perfectly fine. It's really good. It wouldn't be probably so good if it was a block of plastic, but at least it's separate bits. So I'm happy with that. And again, that's obviously air intake or outlet. I'm a bit confused as to what it is, but here, this is where it sits, and the upper hole locks that into place, and you can see it's a bit movable. So I imagine the real thing did that. Don't know much about the Easy 8. And onto the sprocket. So usual stuff with Tamiya wheels with their tanks. You get polycaps inside, so you can put them on and then take them off, which is extremely useful thing to have, because you can always test the lining up and make sure, so in this case, that your bogies are all correctly aligned, and then you can take the wheels off, I think, in these. Yes, you can. Obviously, the normal Sherman has a different running gear to the Easy 8, so I believe you'd have to actually put the arms on the wheels, so you wouldn't be able to take them off. But in this case, all of these wheels can go on and come off, and obviously most of the German armour is that way, designed that way as well. And there's the idler wheels. Now there is one thing you can't get away with, and Tamiya is no exception, that there are huge seam lines around every wheel, which aren't meant to be there, so I just obliterate those by going in with a heavy sander and just clearing that off, which I'm showing you now. So there you can see the heavy line, which we want to get rid of. And that's simple enough. It's soft plastic. It's easy enough to get rid of that, and you just sand that down nice and flat. Try not to get a kind of bevel or curve to it. And then you can see. So I am wrong. It's not polycaps, but you can. They clip together enough that they hold on, and you can put those bogies on, which I did, to make sure the running gear was aligned, and then take them out for painting. And using the Flory sander, a bit of a rough-sided one, I find this one's quite good because it's quite hard, and I can go across that and keep it nice and flat. And this is the part that we were just looking at before on the lower hull. So this is the bit that slots into that on the rear deck. So a bit of a different way of going about it. And then this is the bit at the front, which slots in at the front edge. So you push that in at the front, make sure it's all lined up, and then push it down solidly at the back, and the polycap is what's holding it together. Clever stuff again, as usual. No surprises. And I found this quite impressive, actually, that they've given you that gouge in the side so you can get your drill bit in. A lot of people wouldn't think about that. So you can tell I'm impressed. Very good. So that's for the grab hooks, I believe, for when they were lifting it in the factory. I think that's what goes on there. Some of the holes did not have those. I imagine. That's why you've got to drill the hole. Maybe wrong, I'm certainly no Sherman expert. And now the photo etch begins. So the first thing we can improve is the front fenders. So they have to be cut off first. So I'm using my razor saw here. And just marking along there to make sure it's nice and square. And once we're nearly through, it's just a case of going that extra bit, and there we are, straight through it. A little bit of a curve on there, but we can always flatten that out with the sanding sticks. So those, what would you call it, side fenders, I suppose, are now on, and we flattened it at the front there to take the front fenders. A nice spacer there as well, just to make sure that those side pieces don't sort of lean in. It keeps them nice and flat and solid, and again, just great engineering, good choice to put those right there. Keeps it nice, solid and flat right the way across there. And there you go, the upper hole is starting to come together. Back plate going on just perfectly. It's all, can't say it, I've got to stop myself saying it. It's just very well done. Now the first thing I wanted to improve, as well as using the etch set, was to actually redo some of these handles. It's a typical thing to do in armour. Just doing odd little bits like this instantly lifts the model, gives it some more refinement. So because we've got cast texture built in, I need to put that back on. So I'm using that mark there from where I've cut that off. Obviously just sanding it flush to make sure there's nothing raised there. But I'm using both edges of that. You can still see it's visible to make my mark for the drill bit. So I know that that's where the two parts of the grab handle actually go into the door. Just a little way of making sure you don't, it's an easy way to measure that out. And then once the holes are drilled, then you can go on and apply your cast texture, which I'm doing here. Just simple method, stippling with a brush using Mr. Surfacer 1200. And then just lightly, once that's dry, lightly sanding that in with a Infini sander, quite a high grit, 1500, something like that. Not trying to sand it, just trying to blend it back in with the kit cast texture. It's always best to do this, and before you add any of the more details, I didn't do this, but it could be good to now, at this point, add some primer so you can actually see what it looks like. But I was quite confident that it felt very smooth, and it did turn out. You can't see a difference as you go on through the build. And those doors, I found them just sprang up a little bit, so added some glue and then just held them on. It was almost too tight a fit. And the rear deck, again, what can you say? Slots straight in. Very, very good stuff there from Tamiya. And now there's a lot of handles on the back there, so the same thing applies. Cut them off and drill both ends once they've sanded back a little bit, and then just put the grab handles in. Funny enough, when I actually get to the end of the build, which this is going to be about 3 parts, I think, a lot of this rear deck is covered with some stowage, so you don't actually see it, but good to do nonetheless. Now there was a hole in this section, so this is, I think, where the fuel filler cap is inside there, and it becomes a water trap. So there was a hole drilled into it just to let the water run out at an angle, which I've done there. Just one of the sort of noticeable features on the Sherman, and it carried through to this. I did find some good reference online of a walkabout of a one in America, so a walk around, sorry, of quite good pictures, so I was able to find some cast texture, this hole on that bit, for instance, and various other bits where there's casting numbers and all that sort of thing. So it was a good guide to use. And again, here, this is another bit that screams out to be changed with photo etch, but I chose not to. I just went with the kit side fenders. And then working on the front fender, so you've got that recess there, which is, as Eduard asked you to, if you use a ballpoint pen, you get that raised part on the other side, which is what you're going to see. And then we just need to anneal that a little bit to join up with the curve which is built into that side piece as you bend it over. So I'm just using the a round X-Acto knife there just to kind of work it. If you find it's a bit stiff, you can warm it up over a candle, something like that, and you'll find it will move a bit better. And then clamp that together with super glue, measure it up, and glue it onto the appropriate part. And it was as easy as that. And it, instantly gives a bit of refinement. And I've started working on other bits off of the fret. As you can see, the light guards are on. Visor guards, sorry, are on some of the chains here on each of the fuel caps. And then these parts at the back is for, look, it's a sort of shelf that folds up, and you get that on the photo etch fret. So I've had to fill the parts for where the plastic bit goes using Plasticard, just so we don't have massive, great big indents where it joins. It wants to be sort of bolted to the top as it is and give that kind of look, which I've done there. So it's quite effective. Easy way around that. And you can see the difference, the refinement you get on that. All of this was solid bits of plastic from the kit part. And again, that being a shelf, I do add quite a lot of stowage to that as well at the end. So you don't see all of it, but it's there. It's good enough. That's what I'm saying. It's more kind of, this is more getting me back into the armour, really, as opposed to being a super detailed build for accuracy, if that makes sense. And you can see the difference. Well worth doing. I particularly like those arms that you get that aren't quite completely open, with that nice kink in it. And now just adding the grab handles at the front there. And I've used lead wire because I found it is easy enough to bend, but it does mean that it's quite soft. So you have the slightest knock and you'd get a dent in it. So you need to bear that in mind. And started adding some cast texture and trying to fill around the light guards on the front here. So that's just what I'm walking you through, where I've decided to use some of the cast texture just by stippling again using Mr. Surfacer, and trying to get some kind of weld beads as well for those light guards where they sit onto the hull, because they're kind of welded in a little bit. Quite rough welds, not quite sort of Soviet Russian standard welds, but it's pretty rough. And thankfully, all of the photo etch tool, the photo etch fret gives you all of the tool clamps and clasps, which means you can actually leave the tools off until the end. And as I'm showing you here with that axe, it just kind of slots in as long as you measure it correctly. And then you can tie in the strap around the middle of that once it's all painted right at the end. It saves a difficult job. Otherwise you have to paint it all by hand. It can be a little bit tricky. And the build's starting to come together now with all those tie downs and everything all sorted. We are really heading towards it now. So a few other details I want to finish. Obviously we haven't started the turret yet. So there's a few bits on that that's coming in the next shot that we get to, but we're still just having a run round here, showing you off different things that I find interesting with the handles. And all of these little bits just come together to give you quite a lot more refinement. Now, something you've got to bear in mind with Sherman kits and most American kits is the way the turret is usually comes in the kit. You've got two parts, which gives you this unnatural seam around the back there. Which, the good news is pretty easy to get away with. It's not like building aircraft. You just glue that together, and if you're using the Tamiya Extra Thin and you push it, you'll get that kind of bead running out, so you can sand it back and it starts to fill it. And then just plough over that with adding the cast texture. So that's what I do there. I didn't show you because I've already done it mostly on earlier parts of the build, and you'll see later on how much of that I add on. And you can just stipple it on and then just check it and then do another layer and check it. Quite ingenious how they want you to do the movable mantlet for the gun. So you get these parts that have a polycap in them, so you stick them on, level them up, and then just glue the mantlet onto those pegs. So as long as they're level, that's the most difficult bit about it, is getting them level. And once they are, you just glue it on and it moves then, quite in a nice stiff kind of manner. The one thing that needs sorting out in the on the gun, so we don't have a two-part barrel, but we do have a two-piece muzzle brake. So there's a seam on there that we need to get rid of. So again, using Tamiya Extra Thin, it creates a nice weld bead all around there, which goes a long way to helping with the filling anyway. And I just squeeze that together, and as long as the that hole there as well, for where the projectile leaves, is nice and square, you can then just sand it up. So we just have a seam line on the one-piece moulded barrel, which is easy enough to take care of. You just obviously don't want to use anything too coarse, and just take that seam out and blend it in. And try not to change the profile. You want to make sure it's round all the way across it. And then another piece of refinement is these springs here on top of the, I think it's the loader's hatch. So that spring is actually meant, that hook at the back is meant to be hooked onto the top of the turret, not just lying there. And that obviously is the spring for the door. So it's easy enough to make these springs just using some very fine copper wire around a pin. As you can see, I've just wound it round and round and round. And then sort of pushed it down as I keep going to bring it all together and make it a tighter kind of coiled spring. I was struggling with the focus here, but you start to see it now. So where it spreads apart, just push it together like that. Make sure it's all joined up. I hope I get there in the end. Sorry about this being out of focus. There we go. So you can see it's all just wound around there and pushed together. And then as you take it off, you can bend it around and make the hook. And I've just kind of hooked it around the bit on the door, and then created with a little piece of plastic card just the bit that connects off of the rear part of the turret. It's very effective. It gives you, it's a complete difference to have that on there. And you can see where I don't know what I've done around the top there. I must have sanded it a little bit. So I've started using Mr. Surfacer around there and gone all around the rear part of the turret as well, like I mentioned. Now, I wouldn't have changed this gun out, but where I bought this kit off of Facebook, it had the machine gun in it, as well as the photo etch, I think. Yes, I just bought the light guards, that's right. So I did change out the barrel because it was so good, and it's quite an effective little change again. This is what you can do with armour, and you do it with aircraft as well. If you're going to do super detailing, it's something to look at. Is you could buy everything that's available for the kit, but it's probably a waste sometimes. And if you spend your money on certain things that are highly effective, it takes away from other parts of the kit that maybe aren't so well detailed, but therefore you don't need to worry about it because you've got all of these refinements and people don't see those things, or you don't need to worry about it, or depends who you're building it for. Just sorting out the cupola now, and use Maskell there, so we've got clear parts for the periscope vision ports, I suppose. They might be periscopes, they might just be windows on the Sherman, I'm not sure. But either way, I've masked them out both sides, and hopefully that's pretty effective. So spray the inside of that white. It should look pretty good. The other good news about being a Sherman is tension track, which is really the only place where rubber elastic band tracks, whatever you want to call them, are useful, because you don't actually need track sag very much. There's a tiny bit on the Easy 8 which I do actually do in the next video. I do bend it around just a little bit and give it a tiny bit of sag here and there, but there's really no need to add aftermarket tracks. I mean, the main benefit for those is more detail and refinement, and mainly to give you track sag, which is very important on the German tanks, and obviously the Soviet tanks, but most of the American tanks seem to be tensioned, so they were always tight, so you don't tend to get the sag. So therefore, if I was to use metal tracks on this one, it really would have probably been going against what I want. It would have made it more difficult to make them tight. I would have had to pull the idler back, so it would have been something I didn't need to do. And then one of the last bits of detail that I add here is just drilling out these holes down along the side here, because there was bolt-on fenders for the Easy 8 which came down and shielded the top of the track, and obviously when they were taken off it left bolt holes running along the side. So most of these are pretty good. I do have the odd one in the wrong place, which I just fill with super glue and then drill out the hole next to it. There's a couple here that you can see are quite close, where I'm pointing there. One of them's right, one of them's wrong. So I fill the one that's not right, and that one's a little bit low, but it's all right. And I just have to drill downwards a little bit, because where I want to go, the thickness of the plastic won't let the drill go straight, and I actually snapped the drill bit, and then used my spare and snapped that, and then had to buy another load of drill sets because I didn't have the size that I needed. But that brings this first part to an end. So I hope this has been of interest, and me waffling along all the way through it has been helpful. Just showing you what I prime it with there, so using XF19, but that will be in the next video, so we'll start with that one. So as always, thanks for tuning in, hope you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned for the next part.